It has been a half-decade since Bethesda dropped a teaser trailer for The Elder Scrolls 6. As the years have gone on, the anticipation has been brewing among fans, and how can you blame us? Whenever a generational game comes out, everyone is going to have some kind of interest in the second installment. Of course, it hasn't worked out every time, but hopes are still high, for most people anyway. Maybe it's just me, because I always assume the worst, but the more I learn about The Elder Scrolls 6, the more worried I get. And that isn't irrational thinking either. If you take the time and look at every Bethesda title post-Skyrim, it raises a lot of question marks. Bethesda is a very interesting company to talk about. Aside from Rockstar, there isn't a company who consistently pumps out AAA open-world games like Bethesda. Their games consistently sell, and their player base racks up in the millions. However, as the years have gone on, it seems that the Bethesda formula is starting to fade, and with the disappointing release of Starfield, it's becoming much more apparent the flaws in Bethesda's game design. In this video, I want to quickly go over Bethesda's history post-Skyrim and what it means for The Elder Scrolls 6. Spoiler alert, I'm kinda worried, and let me tell you why. Let's go back in time to 2011, when Skyrim was released for the first time. It took the gaming scene by storm with amazing scores from both critics and gamers alike. It offered a massive open world with an extremely vast arsenal of weapons and spells to combat your enemies with. The world was not only massive, it was littered with random encounters which led to some of the most memorable side quests I've ever experienced. With Skyrim being as iconic as it is, how does it hold up nearly 14 years later? Well, after giving it some thought, I can say this. Skyrim is the most objectively flawed game I've ever played in my life that still gets the generational title boost. Skyrim has a long list of issues, and that isn't a shock to anybody who's played it. The melee combat is objectively terrible. It's literally spamming the attack button as you and the enemy wildly swing at each other until one of you drops. The skill trees look good on paper until you realize they gave every single fucking mechanic in this game a skill tree. Seriously, has anybody actually wasted their time upgrading the block skill tree? Or how about the alternation skill tree? Yeah, I didn't think so either. I have dumped a stupid amount of hours into Skyrim, and I can say with certainty that there is a good chunk of the skill trees I have never touched a single time regardless of the build I'm running. Here's another point that doesn't get brought up enough. The dragons were plastered all over the trailers and the marketing, and rightfully so. I mean, dragons are fucking cool, and fighting them is even better. Minor problem though. Skyrim somehow found a way to make dragon fights boring. Encounters with dragons can be chalked up to playing peekaboo with the dragon until he dies. As long as you have a structure to hide behind, you are at no risk of death. To throw even more onto the pile, the main story is not good, and most of the characters were completely forgettable. However, even with those giant list of problems, I still consider Skyrim an excellent game. I bring up all those issues to raise a question though. Why were we so tolerant of Skyrim and all of its flaws? Because, objectively speaking, this game has way too many problems to be considered a masterpiece. Yet, to this day, it's still considered an all-time classic. Fuck, even I'm sure I've said that at some point. So again I ask, why were we so tolerant of Skyrim? Well, one of the reasons is because of the technological limitations at the time. Starfield, for example, was criticized by most people, including me, for its excessive amount of loading screens. Skyrim also has an excessive amount of loading screens, however, it's much more forgivable because it came out in 2011. Back in the day, super long load times were just par for the course, and thus not a problem. The technological limitations also explain the large quantity of bugs and glitches. The topic of why Skyrim is so beloved despite all of its obvious flaws is something I can spend a 30-minute video doing, so to get straight to the point, Skyrim is blessed that it came out when it did, because if Skyrim came out in, say, 2015 instead of 2011, I don't think it would be viewed as an all-time classic. The passage of time and technological limitations made it very easy to forgive a lot of Skyrim's problems. However, do keep in mind that it doesn't excuse all of Skyrim's issues. The melee combat, for example, really doesn't have an excuse being as bad as it is, but even with its problems, I'd be lying if I said I didn't play the ever-living shit out of this game. It's still Bethesda's best game, bar none, and set the groundwork for open-world RPGs to come. I just think it's fascinating how a game with such a long list of problems can become so popular and beloved. The formula for Bethesda games was set with Fallout 3, but Skyrim was able to take it to the next level. The problem is when you look at the years following Skyrim's release, and the steady and rapid decline that would take place over the next decade. Fallout 4 is a very confusing game to talk about. When it comes to the quality of Fallout 4, there seems to be two groups of people, those who love it and those who despise it. If you ask me, it's a strong 7 or 7.5 type of game, but I can understand why both sides feel the way they do. Fallout 4 is yet another open-world RPG where Bethesda almost completely takes out the role-playing part and dumps you into an open world with a forgettable story and characters. This game does do a lot of things well, though. I think the enemy variety is great, the weapon customization is better than it was in Skyrim, and the skill system is also way better. And the gameplay loop is still fun, for the most part. The issues with Fallout 4 mainly stem from design choices and the lack of RPG elements, which is a trend when it comes to Bethesda games. Fallout 4, at its core, feels like a watered-down New Vegas with prettier graphics. The gameplay loop, while fun, gets repetitive rather quickly, and the lack of RPG elements really drags down the experience. With the release of Fallout 4, Bethesda showed us that they are committed to their formula, since there are no groundbreaking changes from Fallout 3 to Fallout 4. At least that's the impression that I got. And to be fair, Fallout 4 did super well in terms of sales and reviews. I don't think Fallout 4 is an objectively bad or even below average game, but I think that's exactly the problem. If I had to describe Bethesda games that came out after Skyrim, it would be successfully mediocre. Fallout 4 does enough things well to where it can't be considered objectively bad, but it also doesn't do anything amazing or special. No boundaries were pushed, they didn't try anything new. It's the same shit that we've seen before. Is it bad? No, but that's exactly the problem. I'll go more in depth on this point later, but with that said, Fallout 4 is at best a good game with solid replayability and a passable gameplay loop. The story is god-awful with gameplay mechanics that were rehashed from prior games and given a new coat of paint. Fallout 4 does enough to where it can't be considered objectively bad, yet it doesn't do enough to be great. In other words, it's successfully mediocre. And while that's not a title that any game wants to have, it's certainly a lot better than just being bad. Speaking of bad games, let's talk about our next Bethesda title. And no, it's not Fallout 76. I'm just gonna do everybody a favor and not talk about it. Starfield is without question one of the biggest disappointments in the last 5 years. An open-world RPG with customizable ships and a countless amount of planets to explore and loot, it sounded too good to be true, and it turns out I was right. I already reviewed Starfield, and I basically gave it the good but not great rating. Well, after giving it some more thought, I've changed my mind. Starfield is not successfully mediocre, it's objectively bad. I've already gone over the issues with Starfield in my review, however I am going to be repeating a few of those points just for the sake of this video. The exploration in Starfield is shockingly bad. Despite having countless planets to explore, they're all littered with the same shit, and once you figure that out, you have pretty much no incentive to explore. The gunplay was ripped right out of Fallout 4, and yet somehow worse. The story is once again completely forgettable, and if all of that wasn't enough, this game has way too many fucking loading screens for the year 2023. The problems with Bethesda's game design was always there, but Starfield is where those problems became the most apparent. Despite being a brand new IP, Bethesda once again took little risk, and the result was yet another stale and boring game with problems that stem from an outdated engine and poor design choices. So, with all those problems listed out, let's recap for just a second here. We have Fallout 3, which, let's be honest, was not that great. We have Skyrim, which is the textbook example of a flawed masterpiece. Fallout 4, which is yet another passable open-world RPG. We have Fallout 76, which I'm not even going to waste another second talking about. And finally, we have Starfield, which showed us that even when given the chance to break the mold and create something fresh and new, Bethesda will never break from its comfort zone. Well, what about Fallout New Vegas? Well, spoiler alert for those who don't know, Fallout New Vegas was not developed by Bethesda. Instead, it was developed by Obsidian Entertainment, which I find incredibly telling. Does anybody else think it's a coincidence that New Vegas, the best Fallout game to date, was the one Fallout game not developed by Bethesda? Did Obsidian catch lightning in a bottle, or are they just better at developing video games? Now, with all of that on the table, I can finally get to the main point. Look at every Bethesda title after 2011, and what you'll see is a gradual decline in the quality of their games. With Fallout 4, I was a lot more forgiving, but Starfield is when I realized Bethesda has a serious problem. To rehash another point from my Starfield review, the engine used for Starfield is the Creation Engine 2, and Bethesda plans on using the same engine for the Elder Scrolls 6. Learning this information is one of the things that inspired this video, because if you played Starfield, you know just how fucking terrible this engine is. The name of the engine is the Creation Engine 2, and if it wasn't for the number 2 slapped next to the name, you wouldn't know the difference between the Creation Engine 2 and the Creation Engine 1. The main issue I had with Starfield was despite its new engine, it feels exactly like every single Bethesda game from the last decade, and I don't mean that in a good way. Also, don't get me wrong, Bethesda isn't the only company to not change their style of game design over a long period of time. However, I do think they are the worst offenders out of any of the AAA developers. Because sure, Rockstar and Naughty Dog are also AAA developers with outdated game design they've been reusing for the last 15 years, but at least their games are good. Okay, except The Last of Us 2, but most of their games are still good. Bethesda was never good at telling a good story, and now it seems they can't develop good games either. So what do we have now? Well, what we have is a company that refuses to change a clearly outdated formula for their games. A company that somehow made Dragon fights boring. A company that tried reselling Skyrim 4 fucking times trying to relive the glory days. A company that made an open world game with dozens of solar systems to explore, yet it's one of the most restrictive and boring open world games I've ever played in my life. I should have said this in my review, but fuck it, I'll just say it now. Starfield is the culmination of Bethesda's successful mediocrity. 15 years of selling mid-games, a brand new IP, a chance to build something new, and Bethesda completely dropped the ball. Also, here's a little side note to all you Bethesda bootlickers out there. If you enjoyed Starfield, great, I'm happy for you. Unfortunately, I don't have the blinders that some of you guys have. Opinions about video games are subjective, of course, but a subjective opinion is a lot more valuable when it's backed up by facts, not your feelings. Bethesda games have always been flawed right to the core, and to suggest otherwise would be flat out lying. The reason why I'm so hard on Starfield is because aside from Fallout 76, this is bar none Bethesda's worst game. And if Starfield is an accurate representation of what the Creation Engine 2 can do, then you can probably understand why I'm so worried about the Elder Scrolls 6. So with all of that said, let me end off with this. Skyrim is a really fun game with a long list of problems. However, we ignored those problems because the game was fun. The awful melee combat, terrible story, the countless amount of bugs and glitches were swept under the rug. As a community, we were very forgiving of Skyrim, and I promise, that same community will not be as forgiving when the Elder Scrolls 6 comes out, because it's not 2011 anymore. If the Elder Scrolls 6 has similar problems to Starfield, then we have a massive problem on our hands. Also, just a reminder, they're using the same engine, so the possibility of the Elder Scrolls 6 having the same core problems as Starfield? Yeah, quite fucking high. This isn't me being negative for the sake of it. This is 13 years of the same shit from a company that refuses to change. The Elder Scrolls 6 has the chance to be something special. Unfortunately, I said the same thing about Starfield, and we all know how that turned out. Bethesda has gradually lost my trust. Their absolute inability to evolve their core gameplay formula is the ultimate nail in the coffin for this company. And even if you don't want to change up your formula, you're gonna have to use an engine that's way fucking better than this. Now, you can hopefully understand why I'm not so optimistic about the Elder Scrolls 6. To be fair, it's not a lost cause. There is a possibility that the Elder Scrolls 6 will be great, but signs are not pointing towards that. Before I sign off, I want to leave on this final point. When the Elder Scrolls 6 eventually releases, there are only two outcomes. Either it will break the mold and begin a new era for Bethesda RPGs, or it will be the final nail in the coffin for Bethesda and their lineup of outdated games. We're just gonna have to wait and see, and just for the record, I really hope that I'm wrong.